Sarah, when you first walked into that house, what hit you the most?
Tony, I expected dust and decay. What I found instead was my grandfather's secret. Room after room of paintings that seemed to breathe, to watch me. One portrait of a young woman actually turned her head when I entered. I thought grief was making me hallucinate, but then I touched the canvas and felt her sadness wash over me like a tide.
The whole village thought your grandfather was just a crazy old man.
They had no idea he was protecting something that could change everything. These weren't just paintings, Tony. They were vessels for human emotion, memories trapped in oil and canvas. When I realized what I'd inherited, I knew I couldn't keep it hidden.
But what made you think the village would understand?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Sarah, when you first walked up to that house after the funeral, what did you see? I mean, really see, not just the obvious decay everyone in the village had been whispering about for years.
Long pause. You know, Tony, everyone expected me to see what they saw. A gothic monstrosity that time forgot. Peeling paint, broken shutters, gardens so overgrown they looked like something from a fairy tale gone wrong. But standing there with those iron keys in my palm, still warm from the lawyer's hand, I saw something else entirely.
Tell me about that moment. What was different for you?
The windows, Tony. Even boarded up, even dirty, they held light in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Like the house was breathing, holding its breath, waiting. And the silence wasn't empty. Does that make sense? It was full of something I couldn't name yet.
Had you been inside before? As a child, perhaps?
Never. My mother made sure of that. She'd drive the long way around town just to avoid passing grandfather's street. When I asked about him, which I did constantly as a child, she'd get this look. Not anger exactly. More like someone trying to forget a dream that might have been real.
What did she tell you about him?
That he'd lost himself after grandmother died. That he'd filled the house with his obsessions and couldn't find his way back to the world. She used to say he painted his grief until it became something else. Something that scared her.
Something that scared her. Those are interesting words to choose.
My mother was practical, Tony. She believed in what she could touch, measure, explain. She worked as a nurse for 43 years, blood and bandages and healing that made sense. But when she talked about that house, about what grandfather was doing in there all those years, her voice would change.
How so?
Like she was talking about a place where the rules she understood didn't apply anymore. She'd mention strange lights in the windows at all hours, delivery trucks bringing canvases and paints by the dozen, and sometimes she'd say the house seemed bigger than it should be.
Bigger how?
From the outside, looking up at the windows, she'd count more rooms than the original blueprints showed, rooms that appeared and disappeared depending on the time of day, the season. The village started calling him eccentric, then reclusive, then finally just mad.
But you didn't believe that, did you?
I wanted to know for myself. When the lawyer called to tell me about the inheritance, my first thought wasn't about money or property. It was about answers. 47 years of wondering who this man was. Why my mother's eyes would get that distant look whenever his name came up.
So you drove up from the city. What was that journey like?
3 hours through countryside that seemed to step backward in time. The closer I got to the village, the more the landscape felt like it was holding secrets. Rolling hills with morning mist that clung too long, forests where the trees grew in patterns that seemed almost deliberate.
And the village itself?
Caught between centuries, Tony. Stone cottages with thatched roofs sitting next to Victorian houses like they'd been having a conversation across time. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone's story going back 5 generations. Except for grandfather's story. That one, they whispered about.
What kinds of whispers?
Mrs. Henderson from the post office told me he used to order the most unusual things. Not just art supplies, but books on subjects she'd never heard of. Psychology texts, studies on memory and trauma, journals about something called emotional resonance theory.
Did that surprise you?
Everything about him surprised me. I had imagined a broken old man painting the same portrait of grandmother over and over, but the purchasing record suggested someone who was researching, experimenting, building towards something specific.
Sarah, when you finally opened that front door, what hit you first?
The smell. Not mustiness or decay like everyone expected. It was alive, Tony. Like walking into a forest after rain, but underneath that, something warmer. Oil paints and turpentine, yes. but also something that reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen when I was very small.
You have memories of her.
Fragments. She died when I was 4. But I remember her hands when she baked, how flour would dust everything, how the whole house would smell like comfort. Standing in grandfather's hallway, I felt 5 years old again.
And what did you see in that hallway?
Paintings, floor to ceiling, but not displayed like in a gallery. They were integrated, Tony, like they belonged to the walls, had grown from them. And the hallway itself was longer than it should have been, much longer.
Longer than the exterior dimensions would allow?
Exactly. I walked, and the front door kept receding behind me. Each painting I passed seemed to watch me, and I know how that sounds, but their eyes would track my movement.
How did that make you feel?
Not frightened, oddly enough. More like I was being evaluated. Like the house was taking my measure, deciding whether I belonged there.
Tell me about the first room you entered.
His study. A massive space with windows that looked out onto gardens I hadn't seen from the street. The desk was covered with journals, sketches, what looked like scientific notes. But the walls, Tony, every inch was covered with paintings of the same scene.
The same scene?
A woman sitting by a window, reading. But in each painting, she was slightly different. Different times of day, different seasons, different emotions playing across her face. It was grandmother, but it was also every possible version of grandmother.
How many paintings would you say?
Dozens, maybe hundreds. And as I stood there, I swear I could see her breathing, all of them, breathing in perfect synchronization.
That must have been overwhelming.
I sat down in grandfather's chair, just to steady myself, and I found his last journal open on the desk. The entry was dated 3 days before he died.
What did it say?
That he'd finally figured out how to capture not just how someone looked, but how they felt, how they'd felt every day of their lives. He wrote that he'd found a way to paint memory itself, to preserve not just the image of a person, but their entire emotional existence.
Did you believe what you were reading?
I wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a lonely man. But sitting in that room, surrounded by all those versions of grandmother, I felt her presence so strongly, I turned around expecting to see her behind me.
And did you?
No, but I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. Completely safe. Like someone who loved me was watching over me, protecting me.
Sarah, what did you discover when you explored deeper into the house?
Rooms that shouldn't exist, Tony. A library with books that seemed to write themselves as I watched. A conservatory where painted flowers bloomed and wilted in real-time cycles. And everywhere, more paintings of people I'd never seen but somehow recognized.
Recognized how?
Like meeting distant relatives. There was something familiar in their faces, their expressions. I found records later showing they were all people from the village, people grandfather had painted over the decades, but painted in a way that captured their deepest selves.
Their deepest selves?
Their hidden griefs, their secret joys, their unspoken fears, things they probably didn't even know they carried. And Tony, the most extraordinary thing was that each painting seemed to respond to my emotions.
Respond how?
When I felt sad looking at a portrait of a young mother, the painted woman's eyes would fill with tears of compassion. When I smiled at a picture of children playing, their laughter seemed to echo in the room.
How long did you spend in the house that first day?
Hours. I lost complete track of time. When I finally stepped outside, the sun was setting, but it felt like I'd been in there for days. And Tony, the village looked different.
Different how?
More real, somehow. Like I could see the stories behind every window, the histories embedded in every stone. Whatever grandfather had been doing in that house, it had changed my vision.
What was your first instinct about what to do with the property?
Everyone expected me to sell it. The real estate agent I'd spoken with on the phone was practically salivating over the land value. But standing in grandfather's study that evening, reading through his journals, I realized he'd been working towards something unfinished.
What kind of unfinished work?
He believed these paintings could heal people, Tony. Not just comfort them or inspire them, but actually heal emotional wounds by reflecting back their deepest truths. His notes mentioned trauma, grief, the way pain gets trapped in our bodies when we can't process it.
That's quite a leap from traditional art.
That's what I thought initially. But then I spent the night in the house.
You stayed overnight on your first visit?
I couldn't leave. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was necessity. The house felt like it had been waiting for me specifically, and I had to understand why.
What happened during that night?
I dreamed, but not normal dreams. I dreamed my grandmother's memories. I saw her life through her eyes, felt her love for grandfather, experienced her illness and death from the inside.
How could you know they were her actual memories?
Because when I woke up, I understood things about my family I'd never been told. Things I confirmed later when I went through grandfather's papers. The dreams weren't dreams, Tony. They were transmissions.
Transmissions from whom?
From the paintings themselves. From the emotional repository grandfather had somehow created in that house.
Sarah, when did you first realize what you wanted to do with this inheritance?
That morning, sitting in the kitchen eating breakfast surrounded by painted faces that watched me with such profound understanding. I knew I couldn't let this remain hidden. Whatever grandfather had discovered, it was too important to die with him.
But you also knew people wouldn't understand.
The village already thought he was mad. If I started talking about living paintings and emotional healing, they'd assume madness ran in the family. I needed to find a way to introduce this gradually, practically.
How did you envision that happening?
Art therapy, Tony. It was the bridge between grandfather's impossible discoveries and something the world could accept. If I could demonstrate that these paintings helped people heal, maybe the how would become less important than the results.
That's quite an undertaking for someone who inherited a house just days ago.
Laugh softly. I know how it sounds. But sitting in that kitchen, surrounded by generations of painted faces, I felt more certain of my purpose than I'd ever felt about anything in my life.
What was that purpose?
To finish what grandfather started. To prove that art could be more than decoration or expression. That it could be medicine for wounds no one else knew how to treat.
And you believed the village would eventually accept this?
I believed the village needed this, whether they knew it or not. Small communities like this carry generations of unspoken pain. Grandfather had found a way to speak to that pain directly.
Sarah, as we wrap up today's conversation, what would you want people to understand about what you found in that house?
That love doesn't end with death, Tony. That creativity can transcend the boundaries we think are fixed. And that sometimes what looks like madness from the outside is actually the deepest sanity working on problems the rest of us don't even know exist.
Sarah, when you first walked through that front door of your grandfather's house, what did you actually see? I mean, beyond the obvious decay and neglect.
Long pause. You know, Tony, everyone expected me to see what they saw. A hoarder's paradise. Stacks of newspapers yellowed with age, furniture draped in sheets like ghosts. But there was something else. The light moved differently in that house.
The light moved differently?
I know how that sounds. But I've worked in enough homes, enough spaces with people carrying heavy emotional loads, to recognize when a place holds more than just objects. The afternoon sun would hit these particular walls, and I swear the shadows would shift in ways that didn't match the window frames.
Tell me about your grandfather. The village had quite a reputation built up around him, didn't they?
Old Edgar the Hermit, they called him. Soft laugh, 30 years, I lived 2 towns over and I heard the stories. Children would dare each other to ring his doorbell on Halloween. Adults would cross the street rather than walk past his gate. They said he talked to his paintings like they were people.
But you had a different sense of him, even before you inherited the house.
My mother would get these letters from him. Beautiful handwriting, the kind they don't teach anymore. She'd read them at the kitchen table, and her whole face would change, softer somehow, more thoughtful. When I asked her about him, she'd say he saw things others couldn't, that it was both a gift and a burden.
What kinds of things would he write about in those letters?
Memory mostly. How it lives in objects and spaces. He'd describe watching a couple argue in the village square, and somehow he'd know it was the same argument they'd been having for 20 years, just with different words. He'd write about walking past the baker's shop and sensing 3 generations of women kneading worry into their bread dough.
That must have seemed quite mystical to a young person.
I thought he was lonely, to be honest. When you're isolated, sometimes your imagination fills in what human connection can't provide. At least, that's what I told myself. But then my mother died, and he sent me a letter describing the exact moment she passed. He knew things, Tony. Things no one had told him.
So when you inherited the house, you went in with some expectation of the unusual.
I went in expecting to clean out a lifetime of accumulated loneliness and put the place on the market. What I found instead. Pause, have you ever walked into a room and felt like you were interrupting a conversation?
I'm not sure I follow.
The first hidden room I discovered was behind what I thought was a linen closet. The door was painted to match the wall, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Inside, there were maybe 20 paintings. Portraits, mostly. But when I stepped into that space, it felt occupied. Not haunted, exactly. More like walking into a therapy session already in progress.
Therapy session?
The paintings were looking at me, Tony. And I don't mean in that Renaissance way where the eyes follow you around the room. I mean they were seeing me. This one portrait, a woman in her 40s with the most extraordinary sad eyes. As I stood there, her expression shifted, became more curious, less guarded.
How did you rationalize something like that?
For about 10 minutes, I convinced myself I was having some kind of grief response. Stress from my mother's death, the inheritance, being in a strange house. But then I started noticing my own emotional state changing. Standing in front of that sad woman's portrait, I found myself remembering my mother's funeral. Not the ceremony itself, but this moment afterward when I realized I'd been holding my breath for 3 hours straight.
The painting was affecting your memory?
It was creating space for my memory. Like it was saying, here, you can feel this now, you're safe to remember. And Sarah, I have to tell you, I hadn't cried properly since she died. But standing in that hidden room, surrounded by these impossible paintings, I wept. Really wept. And it felt healing rather than devastating.
What did you do next?
I spent 3 days just sitting in that room, bringing my meals in there, sleeping on the floor some nights. Each painting seemed to hold something different. This one elderly man with calloused hands, every time I looked at him, I'd remember my mother teaching me to knead bread. A young girl with defiant eyes would bring up memories of my own teenage rebellions, but with such compassion for that angry young person I used to be.
You began to understand what your grandfather had been doing.
He wasn't just collecting art, Tony. He was cultivating it, growing it. I found his journals eventually, written in that same beautiful script. Page after page describing how emotion and memory could live in pigment and canvas, how healing could happen through witnessing and being witnessed.
The village had no idea they'd been living next door to something like this.
For 30 years, they thought he was the crazy old man who never left his house. Meanwhile, he was developing what I can only describe as a living gallery of human experience. Every profound emotion, every unprocessed grief, every moment of joy too big for one person to hold alone.
Did his journals explain how this was possible?
He wrote about technique, but not the kind you'd learn in art school. How to listen to a canvas before you begin painting. How to recognize when a subject wants to be seen versus when they need to remain hidden. He described painting as a form of emotional archaeology, uncovering layers of feeling that had been buried beneath daily life.
Sarah, I have to ask. When you're describing these paintings as living, as responsive, are we talking about something supernatural here?
Long pause. I think we're talking about something that transcends our usual categories, Tony. When someone carries trauma they've never been able to express, where does that energy go? When a person experiences love so profound it changes their cellular structure, how does that get processed? My grandfather seemed to have found a way to give those experiences form, presence, voice.
And you realized this could be shared with others.
I realized this needed to be shared with others. But carefully, respectfully. You can't just throw open the doors and invite people in to experience something this powerful without proper preparation, without creating the right container for whatever might emerge.
Hence the art therapy center idea.
Hence the most ambitious project of my life, yes. But first, I had to convince a village of people who'd spent 3 decades crossing the street to avoid my grandfather's house that what he'd left behind wasn't madness. It was medicine.
So Sarah, tell me about those first few weeks in your grandfather's house. What was it like, really being there alone with all those discoveries you'd made?
Long pause. You know, Tony, I kept expecting to wake up from some elaborate dream. Here I was, a woman in her 50s who thought she knew exactly what her life would look like for the next 20 years. And suddenly I'm living in this crumbling Victorian mansion surrounded by paintings that seemed to breathe.
When you say breathe, Sarah, help our listeners understand what you were experiencing. Was this metaphorical or were you seeing something more concrete?
Both, really. The colors would shift depending on my mood when I entered the room. If I was anxious about the leaking roof or the heating bills, the landscapes would turn stormy. But if I came in after a good cup of tea, feeling peaceful, the same painting might show a gentle sunrise breaking through clouds. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, the way light hit the canvases differently throughout the day.
But something changed your mind about that explanation.
My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, came by with a casserole. Sweet woman, probably 75, had lived next to grandfather's property for 30 years. She insisted on seeing how I was managing, and I couldn't very well turn her away. When we walked into what I was starting to think of as the gallery room, she stopped dead in her tracks.
What did she see?
The same painting I'd been studying that morning, a portrait of a young woman with sad eyes. But when Mrs. Chen looked at it, Tony, the woman in the painting, began to smile. Not dramatically, not like some movie special effect, just the way a person's expression softens when they recognize an old friend. Mrs. Chen started crying right there in my living room.
Did she say why?
She told me the woman in the painting looked exactly like her sister, who died in a car accident 40 years ago. The sister she'd never properly grieved because she'd been too busy raising her sister's 3 children as her own. She said she'd always wondered if her sister knew how much she was loved, how much she was missed.
And what was your reaction to seeing Mrs. Chen's response?
Terrified, honestly. Because it meant I wasn't losing my mind, but it also meant I was responsible for something I couldn't possibly understand. Here was this sweet elderly woman having what looked like a profound healing moment in my makeshift living room, and I had no idea how or why it was happening.
Tell me about your grandfather during this time, Sarah. You'd inherited this house from someone you barely knew. Were you learning more about who he really was?
That's what kept me awake those first weeks, Tony. I'd rifle through his papers by lamplight, trying to piece together this man who'd apparently devoted his entire life to something that shouldn't exist. His journals went back 50 years, page after page of careful observations about emotional resonance, color theory, something he called memory painting.
Memory painting?
The way he wrote about it, certain pigments and techniques could capture not just an image, but the emotional imprint of a moment. Like how a song can instantly transport you back to your first dance or your grandmother's kitchen, but visual and interactive.
That sounds almost like a form of therapy.
Pause, exactly, Tony. And that's when I started finding his correspondence with doctors, psychiatrists, even a few universities. Apparently, grandfather had been quietly working with people for decades. Individuals who were struggling with trauma, grief, depression. They'd come to the house, spend time with specific paintings, and somehow leave changed.
The village must have had opinions about these visitors.
Oh, they did. Mrs. Chen mentioned it during that first visit. She said folks always wondered about the strangers who'd drive up that long gravel path to grandfather's house. Some came regularly for months, others just once. But Mrs. Chen noticed they almost always looked different leaving than they had arriving. Lighter, she said, like they'd set down something heavy.
Did your grandfather document any of this work?
Meticulously. I found case studies, though he never used real names. Detailed notes about which paintings seemed to respond to specific types of emotional wounds. A seascape that helped people process loss. A forest scene that somehow eased anxiety. A simple, still life with fruit and flowers that he noted was particularly effective for people recovering from addiction.
How did that make you feel about your inheritance, Sarah? Realizing you hadn't just inherited a house, but possibly a calling?
Long pause, overwhelmed, doesn't begin to cover it, Tony. I was a high school art teacher for 27 years. I thought I understood the power of creativity, how art could help people express themselves, but this was something entirely different. This was art that seemed to actively participate in healing.
Were you tempted to simply sell the house, walk away from something so complex?
Every single day for the first month. I had 3 different real estate agents come look at the property, but each time something would happen. The paintings would shift in response to the agent's emotions, and I'd see this flicker of recognition in their eyes, like they were remembering something important they'd forgotten. And I'd realize I couldn't let this place be turned into condos or torn down for someone's dream kitchen.
What finally convinced you to stay and figure out how to continue your grandfather's work?
A phone call, actually. A woman named Margaret, maybe 60 years old, called looking for my grandfather. Said she'd been coming to see him once a month for 3 years, and he'd helped her process her son's death in Afghanistan. She was desperate to know if she could continue her sessions. When I heard the hope in her voice, Tony, I knew I couldn't abandon what grandfather had built, even if I didn't understand it yet.
Sarah, when we left off last time, you were telling me about those first few days in your grandfather's house. You'd found that hidden room, seen those extraordinary paintings. But something happened that changed everything, didn't it?
Long pause. Yes. The third night I was there. I'd been avoiding that room, actually, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing.
What were you feeling during those days of avoidance?
Terrified, if I'm being honest, Tony. I kept thinking about my grandfather's reputation in the village. The whispers about him being unstable, eccentric. I wondered if I was losing my mind the same way people thought he had.
So, you stayed away from the hidden room?
For 2 whole days. I focused on the practical things, called contractors, made lists of repairs, normal, rational activities. But every time I walked past that bookshelf, I could feel something pulling at me.
Like the paintings were calling to you?
That sounds crazy, doesn't it? But yes, it felt like they were waiting. Pause. Then on Thursday evening, I got the phone call that changed everything.
Tell me about that call, Sarah.
It was my neighbor from back home, Mrs. Henderson. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her at first. Her grandson, Michael, had been in a car accident. He was in a coma.
How close were you to this family?
Very close. Michael was like a nephew to me. I'd watched him grow up, helped him with school projects. He was only 19, Tony. Bright, full of dreams. Mrs. Henderson was calling everyone who cared about him.
What did you do?
I wanted to drive home immediately, but it was already past midnight and I'd had some wine. I was pacing the house, feeling so helpless. That's when I found myself standing in front of that bookshelf again.
You went back into the hidden room.
I don't remember making the conscious decision. One moment I was in the hallway, the next I was pulling those books and stepping through that doorway. The paintings were there, just as I'd left them. But this time, something was different.
Different how?
The one that had shown me the meadow before. It was dark now, not black, but like twilight. And I swear, Tony, I could see a figure lying in tall grass, very still.
You thought it was Michael?
I didn't want to think it, but yes. I stood there staring at this painting, tears streaming down my face, and I started talking to it. Begging it, really.
What did you say?
Voice breaking slightly, I said, "Please, if you're real, if any of this means anything, help him. He's just a boy. He has so much life ahead of him." I felt foolish, but I was desperate.
And then?
The painting began to change. Slowly, like watching clouds move across the sky. The twilight grew lighter. The figure in the grass started to move, just slightly. A hand lifting, then an arm.
How did you react to seeing that?
I was shaking, Tony, part terror, part hope. I reached out and touched the painting surface. It was warm, and I could swear I felt a pulse underneath my palm, like a heartbeat.
Did you stay there long?
Hours. I sat on the floor in front of that painting, watching the light grow stronger, watching that figure slowly sit up in the painted grass. I talked to it, told it about Michael, about his dreams of becoming a teacher, about how much his grandmother loved him.
It sounds like you were praying in a way.
Yes, that's exactly what it was. But praying to something I could see responding. Around dawn, the painted figure was sitting upright, face turned toward a golden sunrise that hadn't been there before.
What happened next?
My phone rang. Mrs. Henderson again. But this time she was crying tears of joy. Michael had woken up. The doctors said it was remarkable. No brain damage, minimal injuries. He was asking for his grandmother and wondering why everyone was crying.
How did you process that, Sarah? The timing of it all?
I sat in that room for another hour, just staring at the painting. The figure was gone now. It was just a beautiful sunrise over an empty meadow. But I knew something profound had happened, whether it was coincidence, divine intervention, or something else entirely.
Did you tell Mrs. Henderson about the painting?
How could I? She would have thought grief had driven me to delusion. Hell, Tony, I thought grief had driven me to delusion. But I couldn't deny what I'd experienced.
So what did you do with that uncertainty?
I went back into that room every day after that. I studied each painting, trying to understand what my grandfather had left behind. Some showed peaceful scenes, others depicted what looked like emotional turmoil. And slowly, I began to realize they weren't just paintings.
What were they, in your understanding?
Windows, doorways, tools. My grandfather had somehow created a way to channel healing energy through art. The paintings responded to genuine emotional need. They were alive in a way I'm still trying to understand.
That must have been overwhelming to comprehend.
Terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I kept thinking about all the people who could benefit from something like this. All the pain and trauma in the world that traditional medicine couldn't touch.
Is that when you first considered what the house could become?
Pause. Yes. Standing in that room, surrounded by my grandfather's impossible creation, I knew I couldn't keep this secret. But I also knew no one would believe me if I simply told them. I had to find a way to let the paintings show people what they could do.
That's quite a burden to discover you're carrying.
The weight of it was enormous, Tony. I realized my grandfather had been protecting something miraculous for decades, probably waiting for someone who would know how to share it with the world. And somehow, that someone was me.
So, Sarah, you've been living in your grandfather's house for what? About 3 weeks now? How have you been settling in?
3 weeks and 2 days, to be exact. Tony, I thought I knew what I was getting myself into when I inherited that old Victorian mansion. I mean, everyone in the village had stories about Grandfather Edmund being eccentric, living like a hermit up there on Hillcrest Road.
But something changed recently, didn't it? I can hear it in your voice.
Long pause. Yesterday morning, I found something that's turned everything upside down. I was exploring the 3rd floor, trying to catalog what needed repairs, when I noticed something odd about the wallpaper in what used to be his study.
Odd how?
There was this section where the pattern didn't quite match. When I pressed against it, it gave way. Tony, there was a hidden door behind that wall. A whole room I never knew existed.
Your grandfather never mentioned it?
Never. And we had plenty of conversations over the years, especially after grandmother passed. He would tell me stories about the house, about its history, but he never once hinted at secret rooms.
What did you find when you went inside?
Pause. That's where it gets difficult to explain, Tony. The room was filled with paintings. Not just any paintings, but portraits that seemed almost alive. The brushwork was extraordinary, unlike anything I'd ever seen. But it wasn't just the artistic quality that stopped me in my tracks.
Something else about them caught your attention?
When I walked closer to examine the first painting, a portrait of a young woman with the saddest eyes, I felt this overwhelming wave of grief wash over me. Not my grief, Tony. Her grief. It was as if the emotion was radiating from the canvas itself.
That must have been unsettling.
Unsettling doesn't begin to cover it. I stumbled backward, thinking maybe I was having some kind of episode. Grief can do strange things to your mind, and I've been processing a lot since grandfather's death. But then I approached another painting, this one of an elderly man with a gentle smile.
And?
The sadness lifted completely. I felt this warm sense of contentment, of peace. Tony, I stood in that room for 2 hours yesterday, moving from painting to painting, experiencing emotions that weren't mine. Joy, anger, hope, despair. Each canvas seemed to hold someone's deepest feelings.
Did you recognize any of the subjects in these portraits?
That's what makes this even more mysterious. Some faces looked familiar, like people I might have glimpsed around the village over the years, but I couldn't place them exactly. Others were complete strangers. But every single painting had this quality of capturing not just someone's appearance, but their emotional essence.
How many paintings are we talking about?
I counted 37, all different sizes, but each one incredibly detailed. And Tony, at the back of the room, I found an easel with brushes that looked like they'd been used recently. There were tubes of paint, still soft, and sketches scattered across a small desk.
Recently used? But your grandfather passed away 2 months ago.
Exactly. That's what's been keeping me awake at night. Either someone else has been accessing this room, or grandfather was working on these paintings right up until his final days. The sketches I found, they're of people I've never seen before, but they have that same quality of emotional depth.
Have you told anyone else about this discovery?
Who would I tell? And more importantly, who would believe me? Tony, I'm a rational person. I taught high school literature for 30 years. I don't believe in supernatural nonsense. But I can't explain what I experienced in that room.
What do you think your grandfather was doing with these paintings?
I've been asking myself that same question. There were journals, too, filled with his handwriting. From what I could decipher, he was documenting something he called emotional transference. He wrote about capturing not just people's likenesses, but their psychological states, their deepest feelings.
That sounds like the work of someone who understood human nature on a profound level.
Or someone who had completely lost touch with reality. Tony, the village always whispered that Grandfather Edmund was unhinged after grandmother died. What if they were right? What if I've inherited not just his house, but his delusions?
But you felt these emotions yourself, didn't you?
Pause. Yes, I did. And that's what terrifies me the most. Either those paintings truly do hold some kind of emotional power, which challenges everything I believe about how the world works, or I'm losing my grip on reality just like they said he did.
Sarah, what are you planning to do with this discovery?
I honestly don't know, Tony. Part of me wants to seal that room back up and pretend I never found it. But another part of me feels like grandfather left this for me to find for a reason.
Sarah, when you first started making changes to your grandfather's house, how did the villagers react? I imagine word travels fast in a small community.
Sighs, oh Tony, it was like watching a slow-motion avalanche of gossip. Mrs. Henderson from the corner shop would peek through her curtains every morning when the delivery trucks arrived. I'd see her little face pressed against the glass, counting boxes.
What kind of changes were you making that caught their attention?
Well, I had to gut most of the interior. 70 years of accumulated, let's call it eccentricity. But I was careful about the hidden rooms. Those stayed untouched while I worked on the public spaces. The villagers saw contractors hauling out moldy furniture and boxes of old newspapers, but they had no idea what I was really preserving.
How did that secrecy affect you personally, keeping such a monumental discovery to yourself?
Long pause. It was crushing, honestly. There were nights I'd sit in that kitchen, surrounded by takeout containers and renovation dust, questioning everything. Was I losing my mind, like they thought my grandfather had? Some evenings I'd go down to those hidden rooms just to make sure the paintings were still responding.
Responding how, exactly?
The colors would shift when I was stressed. If I'd had a particularly difficult day dealing with contractors or village council permits, I'd walk into that main gallery room and the paintings would seem almost agitated. Darker hues, more turbulent brushstrokes. It sounds impossible, I know.
But you trusted what you were seeing.
What choice did I have? My grandfather had documented everything so meticulously. His journals showed decades of interaction with these works. He'd write things like, "The portrait of Eleanor showed deep sadness today. Village lost another young man to the war." I began to understand he wasn't just an artist, Tony. He was some kind of emotional archaeologist.
That's a beautiful way to put it. How did you decide to turn the house into a therapy center?
Pause my own therapy, really. I'd been seeing Dr. Morrison in the next town over since my divorce. When I told him about my grandfather's work, he didn't dismiss it. He said art therapy was gaining recognition, that emotional healing through creative expression had solid psychological foundations.
So you brought him to see the paintings?
Eventually, yes. But first I had to finish the renovations. I created consultation rooms on the main floor, a group therapy space in what used to be the conservatory. I kept the living quarters, upstairs for myself. But the real magic happened when I finally showed Dr. Morrison the hidden rooms.
How did he react?
Laughed softly. Poor man went completely white. He stood in front of this one painting, a landscape that seemed to shift between seasons, and I watched 40 years of clinical training wrestle with something his textbooks never covered. He kept reaching toward the canvas, then pulling his hand back.
What convinced him to support your vision?
He brought his most challenging patient, a young woman who hadn't spoken in months after losing her child. She walked into that room and immediately gravitated toward a portrait of a mother and baby. The painting seemed to soften around her. The harsh lines became more gentle, the colors warmer. And she started crying for the first time since her loss.
That must have been powerful for all of you.
Dr. Morrison looked at me and said, "Sarah, I don't understand the mechanism, but I can't argue with the results." That's when I knew we were onto something extraordinary.
But the village still didn't know what you were really doing.
Not yet. They saw the professional signage go up, saw people arriving for appointments. Some of them assumed I was running some kind of retreat for wealthy city folk. Mrs. Patterson made a comment about me turning my grandfather's legacy into a business venture.
How did that criticism affect you?
Pause. It hurt, Tony. These people had known me since childhood, had watched me struggle through my marriage falling apart, my father's death, but they couldn't see past their assumptions about my grandfather. They still thought he was the crazy old man who muttered to his paintings.
You were protecting something they weren't ready to understand.
Exactly. But I was also learning that healing isn't just individual. This whole village carried wounds, Tony. Generations of losses, disappointments, secrets. I began to realize my grandfather hadn't just been creating art. He'd been absorbing their collective pain, trying to transform it into something beautiful.
And now you were continuing his work.
Without fully understanding what that meant yet. The real test was still coming.
Sarah, we've talked about the initial discovery of those remarkable paintings, but I'm curious about something else. How did the people in your life start responding as word got out about what you were doing with the house?
Long pause. Well, Tony, that's where things became complicated. My daughter Emma was the first to really push back. She called me one evening, about 3 weeks after I'd started the renovations, and her voice had this edge I hadn't heard since she was a teenager.
What was her concern exactly?
She said I was throwing my life away on grandfather's delusions. Those were her words. Emma's always been practical, logical. She's a nurse, deals in facts and medical evidence. The idea that paintings could somehow respond to emotions, that they might actually help people heal. Pause, she thought I'd lost my mind.
That must have been painful to hear from your own daughter.
It was devastating, honestly. But what hurt more was realizing how much fear was behind her anger. Her father, my late husband, had struggled with depression for years before he passed. Emma watched me care for him, saw how exhausted I became trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed in conventional ways. She was terrified I was heading down another hopeless path.
So, in her mind, you were chasing after something that might consume you the way your husband's illness had.
Exactly. And I couldn't blame her for that fear. There were moments, especially in those early weeks, when I questioned my own sanity. I'd spend hours in those hidden rooms, watching the paintings shift and change, feeling like they were trying to communicate something I couldn't quite grasp.
You mentioned other people in the village. How were they reacting?
The responses were all over the map. Margaret Thompson, who runs the local historical society, was fascinated. She'd known my grandfather peripherally and always suspected there was more to his reclusiveness than people assumed. She started bringing me old photographs and newspaper clippings about the house's history.
And others weren't so supportive?
Size? The village council was my biggest obstacle. There's a man named Robert Fletcher who's been on that council for 23 years. He saw my renovation plans and immediately started citing zoning restrictions, safety concerns, permit requirements. Every week brought a new obstacle.
Do you think his resistance was really about regulations, or was there something deeper?
I learned later that Robert's son had died by suicide 5 years earlier. A young man, only 26, struggling with trauma from his military service. Robert had tried everything to help him, spent thousands on traditional therapy, medications, treatment centers. Nothing worked.
So your claims about emotional healing through art might have felt like a cruel mockery of his family's tragedy.
Softly, I didn't understand that then. I just saw him as an obstinate bureaucrat making my life difficult. It wasn't until months later that Margaret told me about his son. Then his behavior made complete sense. Here I was, claiming I could heal people with paintings, while his child had died despite every conventional intervention available.
How did that realization change your approach?
It made me realize that everyone who was resisting what I was doing had their own wounds driving that resistance. Emma's fear, Robert's grief, even some of the neighbors who whispered about me continuing grandfather's craziness. They weren't just being difficult. They were protecting themselves from hope that might lead to more disappointment.
That's quite an insight. Did it make you doubt what you were experiencing with the paintings?
There were definitely nights when I'd lie in bed wondering if I was seeing what I wanted to see rather than what was actually there. The paintings seemed most responsive when I was emotionally open, vulnerable. But vulnerability and wishful thinking can look very similar, especially when you're grieving and isolated.
What kept you moving forward despite those doubts?
The paintings themselves, honestly. There was one in particular, tucked away in a corner of the largest hidden room. It showed a woman sitting by a window, and her expression would change based on my mood. When I was sad, she looked compassionate. When I was angry, she seemed understanding rather than judgmental. When I was confused, she looked patient.
That sounds like it could be your mind projecting onto the image.
Pause, that's what I told myself initially. But one evening, I brought a photograph of my husband into that room. I sat looking at it, missing him terribly, and when I glanced up at the painting, the woman was holding what appeared to be a photograph too. The same gesture, the same posture. I hadn't been thinking about my posture or consciously mimicking anything.
And that convinced you the paintings were truly responding, not just reflecting your expectations.
It convinced me that whether it was magic or psychology or something else entirely, these paintings had the capacity to make people feel seen and understood. And sometimes, Tony, that's exactly what healing requires.
Sarah, we've talked about discovering the paintings and your initial steps toward opening the center, but I sense there's something deeper weighing on you. Something about your grandfather's legacy that's been troubling you.
Long pause. You're perceptive, Tony. Yes, there's been something gnawing at me since I found those journals hidden behind the false wall in his study. They revealed a side of grandfather I never knew existed, and honestly, it's shaken my understanding of everything.
What kind of revelations were in those journals?
He wrote about the weight of being the guardian, as he called it, about watching people in the village struggle with their pain while he sat in that house, surrounded by healing he couldn't share. The isolation wasn't just his eccentricity, Tony. It was his burden.
He felt responsible for keeping the paintings secret?
More than that. He felt guilty for not finding a way to help people sooner. There were entries about Mrs. Henderson when she lost her son in the war. He could see her walking past the house every evening, and he knew the paintings could ease her grief, but he was terrified of being seen as a madman.
That must have been an impossible position for him.
One entry particularly haunts me. He wrote about the night he almost approached the village council about the paintings. This was maybe 20 years ago. He had everything planned out, how he'd explain it, how he'd demonstrate their power. But then he lost his nerve.
What stopped him?
Fear, mostly. But also the memory of what happened to his own father. Apparently, my great-grandfather had tried to share the painting's secret once, decades earlier. The village branded him unstable, and the family became outcasts. Grandfather spent his childhood watching his father retreat into bitterness.
So your grandfather was repeating a generational pattern.
Exactly, and reading about it made me question everything I'm doing. Am I making the same mistake he was afraid to make? Am I putting my family's legacy at risk by exposing the paintings to the world?
Have you experienced any pushback from the community that validates his fears?
That's the thing, Tony. The response has been overwhelmingly positive, but there are moments. Last week I overheard two women at the grocery store whispering about whether I was as strange as grandfather. One of them used the word unnatural to describe what's happening at the house.
How did that affect you?
It sent me spiraling, honestly. I came home and sat in grandfather's study, reading his journals until dawn. There's one entry where he questions whether he has the right to burden the next generation with this responsibility. He wondered if he should destroy the paintings before he died.
But he didn't destroy them.
No, and I think I understand why now. In his final entries, there's a shift in his thinking. He writes about hope, about believing that someday the world might be ready for what the paintings offer, that maybe his isolation was preparing the way for someone who could succeed where he failed.
He was preparing the path for you.
Voice breaking slightly. I believe so. But Tony, what if I'm not strong enough to carry this forward? What if the weight of it crushes me the way it did him and his father before him?
Tell me about a moment recently when you felt that weight most acutely.
3 days ago, I was working with a young mother whose daughter had been in an accident. The painting she connected with showed her not just her grief, but a path through it. She left transformed, genuinely healed in a way I'd never witnessed before. But that night, I couldn't sleep.
Why not? It sounds like a profound success.
Because I realized the magnitude of what I'm dealing with. If these paintings can heal trauma, if they can genuinely change lives, then every day I'm not reaching someone who needs help. Someone continues to suffer. The responsibility feels infinite.
Your grandfather struggled with that same sense of unlimited responsibility.
Yes, and I'm starting to understand how it isolated him. There's this journal entry where he describes feeling like Atlas, holding up a world of pain that only he could see. He wrote about the loneliness of being the only one who knew what was possible.
But you're not alone in the way he was, are you?
No, and that's what gives me hope. The village council has been supportive. Dr. Williams from the regional hospital wants to establish a referral program. People are beginning to understand that something extraordinary is happening here, but they're not running from it.
What's different now compared to your grandfather's time?
I think people are more open to unconventional healing. Mental health awareness has grown. The stigma around therapy has diminished. What seemed impossible to explain 20 years ago feels more acceptable now.
Has this realization changed how you view your grandfather's choices?
Completely. I used to think he was simply afraid, but now I see he was wise to wait. He was a guardian not just of the paintings but of the timing. He protected them until the world was ready.
And you believe the world is ready now?
I'm learning to trust that it is. Last week, I started a support group for the family members of people who've worked with the paintings. They needed a space to process their own emotions about watching their loved ones heal.
That's a remarkable expansion of the work.
It came naturally, but it also taught me something crucial about legacy. Grandfather's legacy isn't just the paintings or even the healing they provide. It's the understanding that some gifts require patience, wisdom, and the right moment to be shared.
How has this understanding changed your approach to the center?
I'm moving more slowly, more intentionally. Instead of trying to help everyone immediately, I'm building sustainable systems. I'm training others to work with the paintings, creating protocols, documenting everything carefully.
You're ensuring the work can continue beyond you.
Exactly. Grandfather's greatest fear was that the paintings would die with him. My greatest fear is that I'll repeat his isolation. So I'm building community around this gift instead of guarding it alone.
What would you tell your grandfather if you could speak to him now?
Long pause. I'd tell him that his sacrifice wasn't in vain, that every year he spent alone in that house was preparing for this moment. I'd thank him for protecting something precious until it could flourish.
And what do you think he'd tell you?
I think he'd remind me that legacy isn't about perfection. It's about moving the gift forward, even imperfectly. He'd probably tell me to trust my instincts the way he ultimately trusted his when he chose to preserve the paintings for me.
Sarah, as you continue this work, how do you plan to honor both the weight of this legacy and your own need for peace?
By remembering that I'm part of a continuum, Tony. I'm not responsible for carrying this burden forever, just for carrying it well during my time. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I'll help prepare it for someone who comes after me.
Sarah, we've talked about the paintings themselves, but I'm curious about something else. What did you find in your grandfather's personal papers? Were there journals, letters, anything that explained how he came to create this extraordinary collection?
Long pause. That's where things became truly heartbreaking, Tony. I found decades of correspondence with psychiatrists, art therapists, even some early researchers in what we'd now call neuroscience. My grandfather wasn't just stumbling around in the dark with these paintings. He was methodically trying to understand trauma and healing.
This was during a time when mental health wasn't discussed openly, especially in small communities.
Exactly. The earliest letters date back to the 1960s. He was reaching out to professionals, sharing his observations about how certain artworks seemed to affect people's emotional states. Most dismissed him, of course, but a few were intrigued. There's a fascinating exchange with a doctor in Edinburgh who was studying art therapy with veterans.
Did he ever explain in his own words what he thought he was doing?
There's one journal entry that still gives me chills. He wrote, "The village sees a hermit who talks to paintings. They don't understand that the paintings are talking back, carrying the weight of sorrows that need witnessing. I am not their creator. I am their caretaker."
That must have shifted your entire perception of him.
Completely. I realized I hadn't inherited just a house, or even just magical paintings. I'd inherited a responsibility that my grandfather had carried alone for 60 years. The weight of that hit me harder than I expected.
How do you mean?
Well, here I was, initially planning to renovate and sell, make a profit, and move on with my life. But reading his journals, seeing his decades of careful documentation, understanding the isolation he endured to protect something he believed could help people, how could I just walk away from that?
But that realization must have created its own burden. Did you question whether you were the right person to continue his work?
Every single day, Tony. My grandfather was brilliant, dedicated, willing to sacrifice his reputation and relationships for this calling. I was just someone who'd stumbled into an inheritance. I kept thinking, what if I make the wrong choices? What if I expose these paintings to people who would exploit them or destroy them?
What helped you work through those doubts?
Ironically, it was the paintings themselves. There's one in particular, tucked away in what used to be his study. It shows an empty chair by a window, but when you look at it while feeling uncertain or lost, you begin to see shadows of all the people who might sit in that chair in the future.
And what did you see?
I saw faces of people I didn't recognize yet, but somehow knew I would. A young mother holding a baby, looking exhausted but hopeful. An elderly man with trembling hands, painting for the first time since his wife's death. Teenagers who'd never been listened to, finding their voices through colors and brushstrokes.
So the paintings were showing you the potential impact of continuing your grandfather's work.
More than that. They were showing me that this wasn't really about me being worthy or capable. It was about creating space for healing to happen. My grandfather understood that he was just the vessel, not the source.
Did you find any indication of why he never tried to share this gift with the world more broadly?
He tried, Tony. The letters show multiple attempts to collaborate with universities, museums, medical facilities. But every time he got close to a breakthrough, something would go wrong. Funding would disappear, colleagues would suddenly lose interest, or the paintings themselves would become dormant when removed from the house.
The paintings needed to stay in their original environment?
It seems that way. There are notes about experiments where he tried to loan pieces to a hospital art therapy program. Within days, they reverted to being ordinary paintings. Beautiful, but without the responsive qualities that made them special.
That must have been devastating for him.
I think it's why he eventually stopped trying to convince others and focused on perfecting what he had here. He realized the house itself was part of the equation. The rooms, the light, the energy accumulated over decades. This wasn't just about individual artworks. It was about creating a complete environment for transformation.
And that understanding influenced how you approached the renovation.
Absolutely. Instead of modernizing everything, I found myself trying to honor what was already there while making it accessible to others. Every decision became a conversation between my grandfather's vision and the needs of the people who might find healing here.
How did the village respond when word started spreading about your plans? Sarah, we've talked about the paintings and the therapy center, but I sense there's something deeper you haven't shared yet. Something that changed everything for you.
Long pause, you're perceptive, Tony. There is something. It happened about 3 months after I'd started bringing people to the house. I was cleaning out the last room in the attic when I found my grandfather's journal.
What did it reveal?
That everything I thought I knew about him was wrong. He wasn't just some eccentric artist who happened upon something magical. Tony, my grandfather was a psychiatrist.
A psychiatrist? But the village always said he was a recluse, that he'd lost his mind.
That's what he wanted them to think. The journal explained everything. He'd been a prominent psychiatrist in London for 30 years, specializing in trauma patients who weren't responding to traditional therapy. He came to the village in 1987 after a breakdown.
What kind of breakdown?
He'd been treating a young girl who'd witnessed something terrible. Nothing he tried was helping her. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't engage. One day, in desperation, he started painting while she watched, just abstract colors and shapes. But something extraordinary happened.
The painting came alive?
Not exactly alive, but it began reflecting her emotions back to her. She saw her trauma in the colors, but also saw it changing, healing. For the first time in months, she spoke. She said the painting understood her pain.
So he discovered this gift while practicing psychiatry.
The journal described how he spent the next 2 years secretly developing what he called emotional resonance painting. But Tony, the medical establishment, wasn't ready for it. When he tried to present his findings, they questioned his mental stability.
That must have been devastating for him.
It broke something in him. He came here to hide, but also to perfect his technique. For 35 years, he created those paintings not as art, but as therapeutic tools. Every single painting in that house was designed to help heal specific traumas.
The village never knew they had a healer living among them.
That's the most heartbreaking part. He wanted to help them, but he was terrified of being rejected again, so he watched from a distance, painting their pain, hoping someday someone would understand.
Someone did. You understood.
When I read his notes about Mrs. Henderson's painting, I realized he'd known about her son's death before anyone in the village did. He'd seen her grief coming and prepared a healing space for her. He'd done that for dozens of people over the years.
How did that change your perspective on what you were doing?
I realized I wasn't creating something new, Tony. I was completing his life's work. Every person who came to the therapy center was someone he'd already tried to help through his paintings.
Did you feel pressure to live up to his legacy?
At first, yes. But then I understood something beautiful. His scientific training combined with this inexplicable gift had created something revolutionary. I didn't need to replicate his expertise. I just needed to trust what he'd already built.
The paintings were already programmed, so to speak, for healing.
Exactly. My role became less about creating therapy and more about creating space for people to experience what he'd already prepared for them. It was profoundly humbling.
How did this revelation affect your relationship with the house?
Everything made sense suddenly. Why certain rooms felt welcoming while others felt heavy. Why some paintings seemed to call to specific visitors. He'd organized the entire house as a therapeutic journey.
Did you share this discovery with the people who'd been coming to the center?
I told a few close friends, like Mrs. Henderson. She cried when she learned that her healing had been something he'd hoped for, planned for. It gave her closure about their relationship, or lack of one.
It must have changed how the village viewed him.
Those who knew began to understand that his reclusiveness wasn't madness. It was protection. He'd been healing them from a distance because he was too wounded to do it face to face.
That's a profound kind of love.
It is, Tony. And it made me realize that sometimes the deepest healing happens when we're willing to work through our own pain to help others with theirs. He never healed from his professional rejection, but he kept healing others anyway.
So when people call what you've created revolutionary, they don't know they're really praising your grandfather's revolution.
And that's exactly how it should be. The best healers are often invisible. He taught me that the work matters more than the recognition.
Sarah, I have to ask about something that's been puzzling me. Your grandfather's journals mention someone named Clara repeatedly, but you've never brought her up before.
Long pause. I wondered when we'd get to this part of the story.
Who was Clara to your grandfather?
She was his daughter, my aunt, the sister my father never told me about.
Never told you? Sarah, that's extraordinary. Why would he keep that from you?
Because Clara died in that house when she was 7 years old. My grandfather blamed himself, and my father. Well, he couldn't bear to speak of her.
How does this connect to the paintings? The way you're speaking, I sense there's more here.
Tony, those living paintings weren't my grandfather's gift. They were Clara's. She could paint emotions so vividly that they became real, breathing things.
A 7-year-old child created those masterpieces?
The night she died, she was trying to paint away her fever. She believed if she could capture the sickness and put it in a painting, it would leave her body. Instead, she poured so much of herself into that canvas that she never came back out.
Pause. Are you saying Clara is still there, in the paintings?
I'm saying Clara became the paintings. Every canvas in that house holds a piece of her consciousness. When people feel healing from them, they're experiencing her desire to help, her 7-year-old heart still trying to take away pain.
This changes everything about your grandfather's isolation, doesn't it?
He wasn't a recluse, Tony. He was a father keeping vigil. 60 years of protecting his daughter's spirit, learning to communicate with her through art, letting her practice her gift on him until she was strong enough to help others.
And when people in the village called him mad?
He was talking to Clara. All those years of seeming to speak to empty rooms. He was raising his daughter the only way he could.
How did you discover this truth?
She spoke to me. The first night I stayed in the house, I heard a child's voice asking if I was there to help her help people. That's when I understood my grandfather's real legacy.
So the Art Therapy Center isn't just using Clara's paintings. It's fulfilling her original purpose.
Exactly. She's finally able to heal others the way she always wanted to heal herself.
Sarah, when you realized the paintings were responding to the villagers' deepest traumas, how did that change your understanding of what your grandfather had been protecting all those years?
Pause. It was like watching a key turn in a lock I didn't even know existed, Tony. These weren't just magical paintings. They were mirrors. Each one seemed to hold space for pain that had nowhere else to go. When Mrs. Henderson touched that landscape and started weeping about her son, I understood my grandfather hadn't been hiding from the village. He'd been preparing for this moment.
Preparing how exactly? What do you think he knew that you didn't?
He knew the village was carrying wounds that traditional healing couldn't reach. 3 generations of families who'd lost sons in wars, mothers who'd buried children too young, marriages that crumbled under unspoken grief. The paintings weren't responding to emotions. They were designed to transform them.
That's quite a responsibility to inherit. Were you afraid of what might happen when you opened the house to everyone?
Terrified. Soft laugh. But Tony, I'd spent weeks watching these paintings respond to my own memories. The one of the garden brought back every conversation I'd had with my grandmother before she passed. I felt her presence so clearly I could smell her lavender soap. If they could do that for me, imagine what they might do for people who'd been carrying pain for decades.
How did you prepare yourself for that kind of emotional intensity from an entire community?
I didn't prepare, really. I just trusted what my grandfather had built. But I did spend one whole night walking through every room, talking to him, asking him to help me be worthy of what he'd left behind. The paintings seemed to glow differently that night, like they were listening too.
What was your plan for the grand opening? You couldn't exactly advertise magical healing paintings, could you?
Laughs? Hardly. I simply invited everyone for tea and to see what I'd done with the old place. But I positioned certain paintings where I knew specific people would encounter them. Mrs. Henderson near the battlefield scene, the Thompson family by the painting of children playing. I trusted the paintings to do what they'd been created for.
That sounds like an enormous leap of faith, Sarah.
It was. But standing there that morning, watching the village gather outside the house my grandfather had kept closed for so long. I knew we were about to discover what real healing could look like.
Sarah, we're approaching something that feels like a turning point in your story. After everything you'd discovered about the paintings and your grandfather's work, what was going through your mind?
Long pause. I remember standing in that main gallery room, watching how the paintings had begun responding to the villagers who'd started visiting. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, Tony.
Tell me about that weight. What exactly were you feeling responsible for?
My grandfather had protected this gift for decades, kept it safe from those who might exploit it or destroy it. And here I was, opening the doors, letting people in. What if I was making a terrible mistake?
But you'd already seen the healing happening. Mrs. Whitmore with her grief, the others finding peace. Wasn't that proof you were on the right path?
That's what made it so terrifying. The more powerful the healing became, the more I understood what my grandfather had been guarding against. There were already whispers in neighboring towns, rumors spreading about the miraculous art therapy center.
What kind of whispers concerned you most?
Voice-tightening people with money, Sarah. Collectors who saw dollar signs. Researchers who wanted to study the paintings like specimens. Even well-meaning therapists who thought they could replicate what was happening here.
So you were facing the same choice your grandfather had faced years earlier.
Exactly. Hide it away to keep it safe, or trust that sharing it was worth the risk. But I had something he didn't have when he made his choice to withdraw.
What was that?
The village itself. These people who'd been touched by the paintings, who understood what we were protecting. They weren't just visitors anymore, Tony. They'd become guardians, too.
That must have given you strength, knowing you weren't alone in this.
It did. But it also raised the stakes. If I made the wrong choice, I wasn't just risking my grandfather's legacy. I was risking the healing these people had found, the hope they'd discovered.
So, how did you prepare yourself for what was coming?
Pause. I spent one last evening alone with the paintings, asking my grandfather for guidance. And Tony, I swear I felt him there, in every brushstroke that glowed softly in the lamplight, telling me it was time to trust completely.
Sarah, we're approaching something profound here. The paintings have revealed their deepest secrets. The village has embraced what your grandfather protected. But I sense there's one final piece to this puzzle.
Long pause there is, Tony. The morning after the village gathering, I found a letter from grandfather, hidden behind the very first painting I'd discovered.
What did it say?
That he'd been waiting his entire life for someone who could see what I see, not just the paintings moving, but their purpose. He wrote that the house would know when the right person arrived.
The house would know?
The paintings weren't just responding to emotions, Tony. They were teaching me. Each one I encountered was preparing me for what comes next. The woman with the flowing dress showed me grace under pressure. The stormy seascape taught me to weather doubt. The garden scene revealed how growth requires both light and shadow.
And what does come next, Sarah?
Voice strengthening. The center isn't the end goal, it's the beginning. There are others like grandfather scattered across the world, guardians of similar collections. People who've been dismissed as eccentric, hiding extraordinary gifts because the world wasn't ready.
How do you know this?
The final painting showed me. A map of sorts, but not of places. Of people. Their faces, their locations, their loneliness. Just like grandfather was lonely, protecting something beautiful that he couldn't share.
Until you arrived.
Until the world was ready, Tony. The therapy center proves that people are hungry for healing that goes beyond conventional methods. They're ready to believe in something larger than themselves.
So this village, this house, it's all been a test case?
A beacon. Word is spreading about what we've accomplished here. I've received letters from families dealing with trauma, therapists seeking new approaches, artists who've always felt their work was somehow alive.
And you're going to help them connect with these other guardians?
We're going to build a network, Tony. A quiet revolution where art becomes medicine, where the dismissed and misunderstood become healers. Grandfather spent his life preparing for this moment.
Pause. It sounds like you've found your true calling.
No, Tony. I found my inheritance. Not the house, not the paintings. The responsibility to ensure that no one else has to guard these gifts alone.
Sarah, this is the moment everything changed, isn't it? When the village finally understood what your grandfather had been protecting all those years?
Long pause. It was the evening of our first community session. Mrs. Henderson walked into the room where her late husband's portrait hung, and Tony, the painting, began to glow with this warm golden light.
What happened next?
She reached out to touch it, and suddenly she was crying, but not from sadness. She said she could feel his forgiveness, his love, that he understood why she couldn't save him from the cancer.
And the others witnessed this?
Every single person in that room. The baker, the shopkeeper, even the mayor who'd called my grandfather a madman for decades. They watched as painting after painting responded to people's deepest wounds.
How did that change things for you, Sarah?
I realized I wasn't just inheriting a house or even grandfather's gift. I was becoming the bridge between his world and theirs. The guardian he'd trained me to be without either of us knowing it.
So, Sarah, as we wrap up your remarkable story, what do you think your grandfather would say if he could see the center today?
Soft smile. I think he'd be amazed by the laughter echoing through those halls. For decades, that house held only his solitary wonder. Now children run past the living paintings, and elderly visitors sit quietly with portraits that somehow understand their grief.
The village has certainly changed its perspective about him.
Completely. Mrs. Henderson brought her grandchildren last week. She told me she finally understands why he kept to himself. He was protecting something too precious to risk losing. The paintings needed that sanctuary to survive.
And what about you? How has this journey changed you?
I came here expecting to sell a crumbling house and escape quickly. Instead, I discovered my life's purpose. Those paintings taught me that art isn't decoration, it's healing. Every day I watch people find peace they thought was lost forever.
A beautiful legacy continued.
Transformed, Tony. Granddad preserved the magic. I learned to share it.
So, Sarah, as we wrap up today, what would your grandfather think if he could see the house now?
Soft laugh. I think he'd be amazed that his secret finally brought people together instead of keeping them apart. The art therapy sessions have helped so many villagers process their grief, their fears.
The paintings still respond to emotions?
More beautifully than ever. Yesterday, Mrs. Henderson worked with the meadow painting during her session about losing her husband. The flowers bloomed brighter as she talked through her memories.
And the village's perception of your grandfather?
Completely transformed. They understand now that he wasn't hiding from them. He was protecting something sacred until the right time. Children leave drawings on his grave, thanking the magic painter man.
What's next for you and the house?
We're expanding the therapy programs. Artists from neighboring towns want to study here. But most importantly, we're continuing grandfather's real work, proving that healing happens when we stop hiding our deepest truths.
A beautiful legacy, Sarah.